Good morning, everyone. My name is Vicky Tung. I'm the Programme Manager for Futures and Innovation here at the International Civil Society Centre. I'm here today with our main presenter and the author of our sector guide, Bertram Lang, who's a Research Associate at the Goethe University, Frankfurt. So a quick introduction for those of you who aren't aware of the Centre. We're owned by 15 of the world's leading international civil society organisations, and we exist to strengthen their impact and resilience, primarily by playing three roles: as a sector convener, a platform for multi-agency collaboration, and as an innovation broker. Under our innovation and futures work, we have been hosting the Scanning the Horizon sector community since 2015, which really brings together global strategists and organisational learning and development specialists from the leading international CSOs, national CSO umbrella platforms, and the private sector for a peer community which looks at future strategy, learning and understanding trends in a collaborative manner. This year we've taken a deep dive to look at the implications of China's global rise for our sector and for international CSOs, regardless of whether they have a presence in China or not. This is one of the most influential trends which we see globally influencing the trajectory and direction of other trends for sustainable development. It's a really large and unpredictable topic, and individual organisations have limited capacity and resources to really scope out what it means for themselves. Hence, we've been doing this collaboratively across a range of organisations which also bring a diversity of strategies to their engagement with global China, from a pragmatic approach to more principled advocacy stance, or a range of strategies within that. As I mentioned before, it's really for global applicability. Some organisations have a presence or team in China, others don't. But what we really wanted to do with the pooled insights from this set of organisations was come up with a set of practical recommendations for strategic adaptation within organisations, but also identify some areas for further collaboration as a sector. So we have developed the guidance. It's on our website already with the kind support of the MacArthur Foundation. Everything that you're hearing today is documented, so please do go and look at the report if you haven't already. But it's a really good opportunity to hear from Bertram firsthand on the thinking and the consensus and perhaps divergence of opinions between some of the ICSOs that went into the writing of this report. So with that, I will hand over to Bertram to take us forward with the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vicky, and hello from my side as well. So for those of you who weren't here last week for the first part of this webinar, last week we talked about the cross-cutting strategy recommendations. So in terms of strengthening individual organizations' capacity to adapt to those trends and also strengthening sector collaborative capacity. So today we're going to the more content side. So based on what we already discussed at the Scanning the Horizon meeting in Hong Kong in June, together with ICSC, we identified what we think are four key drivers along which China's growing global influence on civil society can be organized. So these are heuristic tools rather than definite or conclusive enumerations. So of course, there are also other issues which do not neatly fall into line with those, but we want to focus on those four most important trends. So Vicky is going to show those on the next slide. So the first one, and I'm going through them, as Vicky said, one by one, and you will be able to ask questions after each of them. They're broken down into changes in Chinese investment and development finance under what has become the major label for China's foreign policy, particularly towards the developing world. So as most of you who are dealing with China issues over the past years have noticed probably, is that many of the countries that our core target audience, so ICSOs with a certain development focus, are working in and are usually referring to as the global south or developing countries, are now being referred from the Chinese side as kind of Belt and Road countries or countries along the Belt and Road. So this is what we're talking about. The second is China's aspiration to become a global technology leader and what this means in very diverse manners for civil society organizations. The third one, certainly the one where I see the most also positive opportunities for engagement, is the nascent internationalization of Chinese non-governmental actors of all sorts. And finally, one trend where there's, of course, more of a need to counter, especially the Chinese Communist Party's growing influence on global governance and its impact in the UN system. We still find some potential for cooperation, but on the fourth trend, this is the one where we see the most urgent need for action for civil society to get better organized. So an overall statement from the beginning, as you'll see also from the diverse target audience of this report. We have both purely service delivery oriented ICSOs and more advocacy and rights-based organizations. We're really trying to balance in this report and in these recommendations what we think is a double need of both engagement, productive cooperation with Chinese actors for the benefit of our own target audiences and our own understanding of what are common global public goods to be achieved, and on the other hand, the need for civil society organizations across the world to stand up to certain threats that come from not only China, the Chinese Communist Party, but the growing global influence of authoritarian governments overall. And China is definitely, in terms of global reach, one or the most important country to look at in this regard. So this is also why you'll find in those recommendations very different kinds or recommendations going into very different kinds of directions, and certainly no organization will find all of those recommendations being applicable to themselves, but we still think it's important to consider them jointly because we think there's no, for civil society as a sector, there's no either or in terms of engagement and confrontation. So we're coming to the first driver. So obviously, the Belt and Road Initiative is above all also a flagship foreign policy initiative that's not changing everything overnight. Chinese development finance, especially to Southeast Asia and Africa, has been around for a couple of decades now already, but things are quickly moving and they're quickly changing. And so the first thing for ICSOs to do in our view is to carry out more what we call more action-oriented research. There's a lot of academic research now into assessing the impact, the developmental impact, environmental impact of Chinese overseas investment. And this is not for ICSOs to do, this is for academics to do. What organizations with a global presence in many developing countries and local chapters or local member organizations can really do is to try and carry out more projects that look into what can actually be done about certain, either in terms of improving the potential, the positive potential of Chinese development finance, or in addressing certain problematic aspects such as lacking environmental impact assessment, negative impact of certain investments. And so this is like a call for getting together between researchers and ICSOs to make use both of social science research tools and the local expertise and local contacts of ICSOs. The second, in terms of more campaign and campaign strategy and change theory, what we discussed in Hong Kong, one important issue is that when we talk about development finance, there are certain specific traits to Chinese development finance. However, there's also a lot that is not so different fundamentally from other donors, particularly not from other East Asian donors, and therefore also in terms of like achieving impact and getting, for example, Chinese companies to adjust their behavior, it seemed to be much more productive to promote cross-cutting sector-wide approaches to topics like business behavior and human rights standards, rather than putting out reports about labeled as Chinese human rights or Chinese labor rights abuses in XY country. So one positive example that also the organization was happy to be shared publicly is a campaign run by Amnesty International on cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where Chinese actors of all sorts, so intermediaries, but also large state-owned enterprises do play an important role at various stages of the international value chain. However, they're not the only ones that are involved, and therefore the focus was really on the whole global value chain of cobalt mining, and they were able also to address and engage with those Chinese actors because of that more general focus and that more solution-oriented approach. Another issue also that comes up when we talk to Chinese NGO or business representatives is that they usually, in face of criticism, usually refer to the fact that they are respecting local laws in the target countries where they invest in. So often criticism from so-called Western-based civil society organizations can be discarded as undue interference because, for example, a company refers to the fact that they're respecting Zambian labor law. So we shouldn't forget that it remains important and becomes even more important to advocate, first of all, based on the existing laws for their respect by all kinds of actors, not only Chinese, obviously, because there are many violations by foreign investors of all kinds, but also for the improvement of local labor and environmental standards, which can then be used in a second step to hold, for example, Chinese actors accountable, because often one specific problem is that those local laws either are completely insufficient, not at all enforced, or in the case, for example, with special economic zones that are being set up after the model of China's development or China's own domestic development, for example, in Myanmar. Those zones get up specifically to lower labor standards, and then of course it's easy to say that we're in line with local laws if they are artificially lowered. So this is one issue also for civil society to target. Then on the other hand, we've had many interesting examples of what we called in the last session, what we called insider organizations, insider ICSOs that are working in China as well as on global China issues to be able to influence policy focus, for example, strengthening the sustainability focus in the Belt and Road Initiative, contributing, of course, not, it's very hard to assess the actual influence, but contributing to a slow change towards what the Chinese government now calls greening the Belt and Road. So introducing all kinds of at least soft safeguards and also changing laws and regulations for overseas investments, which still need to be properly implemented. But in terms of the formal regulations, we've seen really some progress over the past years. And so this is also a worthwhile effort to continue in cooperation with Chinese actors to continue this kind of lobbying. And then finally, on the other hand, working with local civil society actors in Belt and Road countries remains as important as ever, because as for Western multinationals as well, without significant reputational costs of violating labor laws or violating environmental standards, we cannot expect any significant change in company behavior. Can we go into the next slide? Thanks. And then on the other hand, so this is probably more for the kind of insider organization or more service-oriented organizations with good ties already in the People's Republic. Several of them mentioned the future possibility, the future availability of Chinese development funding as a major trend for the next 10 to 15 years. So for now, we can say that Chinese official development finance does remain very much government-centered and centered on those large-scale projects where civil society, either Chinese or international, doesn't play a significant role. This also continues to be true for the new Chinese International Development Cooperation Agency, which hasn't so far, at least, fundamentally changed that approach, and which is reaching out much more to governmental development agencies. There is some contact to ICSOs as well, but not a concrete perspective seems to be in in view for funding to this particular channel. However, several Chinese NGOs and foundations which are going out, as the Chinese government slogan goes, and which are looking to increase their activities outside of China, they're actively lobbying those official development actors to be more open in terms of funding, to increase their trust towards third sector actors, and to create a formal possibility of public procurement for NGOs in overseas development work. So this trend is definitely one that needs to be monitored. There's also an official Belt and Road people-to-people platform. So the new Chinese slogan that's been around for a couple of years is 民心相通. So literally, let the people's hearts communicate. So this is, of course, very nice Communist Party speak for trying to build a stronger people-to-people, we could call it civil society cooperation platform as an additional pillar, or which is basically strengthening the fifth pillar of the Belt and Road. And this platform is actively inviting foreign participation, of course, with a focus on more culture, youth education, etc. So politically non-sensitive topics. So this is for every individual ICSO to evaluate and how far they want to be part of this. But at least there's this outreach. Interestingly, also driven by the Ministry of Tourism and Culture in this particular sense, but which also Chinese Congo representatives are directing ICSOs towards. And then in the future, we're expecting that funding may become available for service-oriented ICSOs with good established trust links, most likely via some kind of joint ventures or cooperation with Chinese NGOs or SOEs, state-owned enterprises that are concerned about their reputation or the impact of negative public opinion abroad on their investment success. Of course, in all of this, there's always the risk of political strings and also of competition for funding between civil society organizations, both between ICSOs themselves, but also between ICSOs and Chinese third sector organizations involved. So it's a general question to ask whether ICSOs should even want to compete for that kind of funding with local Chinese organizations, or if this is not something that they should leave to the Chinese organizations.
Great. So that brings us to the end of the first section on the RI. Were there any particular recommendations from anyone? If so, please pop in the chat and Bertram can answer them. Okay, so there don't seem to be any questions. Bertram, do you want to move on to technology?
Sure. Okay, so I think it's no secret to anyone, whether China focused or not, that China as a country or the Chinese economy is making huge advances and very rapid advances in many, especially new technology sectors. So the first recommendation may sound pretty mundane, but in light of the discussions we had in Hong Kong and in light of the lack of deep understanding so far within the ICSO community of those developments and what they mean, especially for civil society in the global south, it's really important to step up efforts to monitor those developments in own areas of work. And this concerns, of course, everything from humanitarian work, health work, education, etc. So some of those trends may be related to government or high-level government policies like the Made in China 2025 strategy. There's no general agreement in how far this policy will still be around in 10 years and how far it's really going to be consequential in the long run, but definitely the focus areas that are defined in this governmental strategy are very important areas such as renewable energies, but also medical devices, which bear the potential if China achieves a technology leader position there. to be externalized for the benefit of developing countries. And on the other hand, obviously, we do have the huge issue, which has also become very big in Western media. So the issue of technology, facial recognition, etc., which I think it's more obvious for civil society organizations to keep track of. And related to this, we felt that building partnerships specifically on China issues with IT expert and tech specialist NGOs in Europe and the US especially, which don't necessarily have a China focus, but do have the expertise in this area of work, is a really important thing to do for those more traditional ICSOs which don't have a specific tech focus themselves. So there's a lot of NGOs, of course, that are trying to make technology more humane, more ethical in Western democracies. There's also organizations like the Internationalisation, which does have a Hong Kong chapter and therefore does have much more expertise in that regard. But generally, the kind of partnerships on China issues need to be strengthened in that regard. So avoiding simplification of developments is something we put in there because it's a general feeling of people who work more specifically on China tech issues that the kind of general understanding we have about those developments is way too simplified and dominated by dystopian narratives, especially about things like the social credit system. This is not to say that this doesn't have worrying elements also for civil society, but if you want to do targeted advocacy and not simply raise awareness, because there now seems to be a lot of awareness in liberal democracies about these developments. If you really want to do something more in a more targeted way, one really needs to get into the nitty-gritty. For example, if we talk about the social credit system, while everyone seems to agree here in Europe that this is just a horrible totalitarian dystopia, at the same time, Western companies are getting prepared to implement those requirements in their activities in China because they're asked to do so. And there are obviously also positive potentials of the system in terms of governance and anti-fraud, etc. So rather monitoring specifically how, for example, foreign companies comply with those standards and what are the ramifications of this seems to be a much better strategy for civil society to actually achieve an impact or also make a differentiated impact from what's already around in the media. And the second aspect is related to this. So there is a general feeling that for now, for international civil society, but also for Chinese civil society organizations, there's very limited possibilities to have any impact on Chinese tech giants, at least as they are focused on their domestic China activity. Although we've seen some concerns about the use of private data in facial recognition within China, so it's a topic, as long as it's about private companies' use of data and technology and their abuses, this seems to be a topic which can be raised both by individuals, even in court cases, but also by NGOs potentially. So this might evolve in terms of being Alibaba and Tencent or other scale. I think for ICSOs, the role should rather be to focus really on what Western multinational companies are doing related to, for example, in terms of selling surveillance technology to Chinese operators. But also, if we talk about countries like Ecuador that have imported Chinese surveillance technology and deployed it, so officially democratic countries, these are really the trends and the things where civil society impact, both by ICSOs and local civil society organizations in those concerned countries, is important and can have an actual impact. Then going to the opportunities side. So Chinese technological innovations do bear a lot of potential for solving development problems in many different sectors. So we've had examples from an American ICSO path, which has managed to, or which has identified a Chinese vaccine against Japanese encephalitis that was only domestically deployed so far, and they managed to assist that company in internationalizing this, achieving the necessary standards, and to make it accessible at reasonable prices in developing countries. There's other corporations, for example, with Tencent on tracking poaching and to protecting wildlife based on their technologies. Of course, the deployment of mobile communication networks by Chinese operators such as Huawei in across large parts of sub-Saharan Africa does also come with a lot of possibilities to use smartphone technologies for all kinds of development purposes, whether it is to improve education in rural areas, access to education, or even monitoring of governance at local level through smartphone technologies. Limited success examples in this regard so far, but definitely potential to be further explored. At the same time, there's a lot of developments which appear to have both this positive potential and are ethically ambiguous. Again, this is not specific to Chinese technology, but when we talk about ethics roundtables, such as the one initiated by the World Economic Forum, recently also in cooperation with ICSOs, there seems to be a lack of attention to the specific Chinese innovations and the specific China angle of those discussions. So, for example, when a Tencent charity foundation is priding itself on tracking lost children across the country, and they have an enormous, if you believe their communication, they have an enormous success rate at finding children that are either abducted or get lost across the country. How do they do it? Through facial recognition technology and the omnipresent surveillance. So this is one aspect where there is an obvious benefit and an obvious downside from a civil society perspective, and there needs to be more specific and also integrative global discussions about the ethical aspects of such development.
Thanks, Bertram. So we have a point that ICSOs should be calling on Chinese business actors to respect Chinese environmental standards. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. So this is what I meant in terms of there has been success in recent years in terms of improving the standards or externalizing certain domestic environmental standards for overseas investments. So domestic environmental standards for Chinese actors still are a lot stricter across the board than for overseas investments. This is also true when we talk about like renewable energies, or there's still a lot of traditional polluting energy investments financed by Chinese development banks abroad. So there is a gap in standards, but yes, there's also this implementation gap, which really needs to be zoomed in on. We do have a lot of standards, due diligence standards, which are there in law, but they're not implemented. And yes, absolutely, this is one of the focus areas where we think there's also potential to work together between ICSOs and Chinese NGOs, especially in the environmental sector, to improve the monitoring and implementation. And even this can even be presented as a service to the Chinese government in terms of improving the risk management of Belt and Road investments. So I fully agree with that, and I maybe didn't make it clear enough before.
Thank you. We'll move on to the internationalization of Chinese NGOs, but please continue posting comments or questions in the chat, and we will come back to them at the next stopping point.
Yes, so this, of course, is kind of a cross-cutting trend when we talk about engagement overall. So we are seeing over recent years that more and more Chinese NGOs and also philanthropic foundations from very low levels are starting to internationalize. This started off with one-off humanitarian activities, humanitarian assistance, for example, in Nepal, Myanmar, and neighboring countries. but is increasingly going to a more institutionalized level. So, for example, the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation just opened its 3rd overseas permanent office in Ethiopia this year. So there's a lot going on, and where ICSOs with a much longer experience in terms of like also both a local country expertise, but also the technicalities of working across borders in nonprofit manners can support this trend and help Chinese actors in these and deploying these activities. We do have good examples. For example, one very positive example, which is also why we can mention it in name here, is Mercy Corps' year-long support for the China Foundation for Poverty Alleviation in terms of building its capacity to internationalize. Also putting out a guide to Chinese NGOs willing to internationalize in Chinese, which is publicly available. And what we think is the next step to do is to promote more two-way partnerships. So go beyond the simple ICSOs capacity building for Chinese organizations, but really try and identify what are the domestic strengths of Chinese NGOs. Because the development experience is so different and so much more recent domestically for many Chinese NGOs that have been working in Sichuan and Yunnan, they do have a lot of local experiences which may potentially be internationalized. And here we need to think more about a combination of strengths rather than just supporting them to internationalize for the sake of internationalizing. At the same time, one common question by ICSOs which don't have this long-standing China presence when they are approached by Chinese actors is, how do I find out if this is a real NGO or just a fake NGO or governmental organized NGO or Gongo? Sometimes it's pretty obvious if you look at their historical track record and their activities and the way also they frame their activities. Sometimes it's much more difficult because often links to the party state are informal, but still when entering or when considering to enter into partnerships here, ICSOs do need to be aware of differentiated institutional constraints under which those partners are acting. So this is very different for Gongos, which are politically much more secure, but of course also more closely tied to a government agenda. Whereas for more independent NGOs, of course, the constraints are different, less political constraints, but also higher risks in terms of being impacted by what the international partner organization does. So another way forward, which is already being explored by or routinely explored by those organizations which do have a permanent presence in China, of course, but as a recommendation for those which don't, is to strengthen partnerships with Chinese academia and foreign policy think tanks, which do have an important consulting role in designing and adjusting policies related to the Belt and Road. And for Chinese academia, despite the increasingly tense climate for Chinese academia and social sciences overall in recent years, on issues like humanitarian assistance, philanthropy, charity, etc., a lot is moving. There are many new institutes that have been created over recent years and which are actively looking for international partnerships, both to secure funding, but also to gain international legitimacy. And at the same time, those are also ways of feeding ideas and policy suggestions into the system when this is not possible by going directly to a ministry. And another important part, which is partially explored, but I think really still underused, is to look to not only go to Beijing, not only look at the national policy level, but to look at local and municipal levels, particularly in cities which are trying to play a more important role within the overall Belt and Road framework. So one obvious example related to tech is Shenzhen municipality, which is setting up its own foundations to internationalize local tech innovations. but also if we look to Sichuan, which has made tremendous efforts to play a more important role or to strengthen its own role in the Belt and Road networks. I'm less familiar with that situation than with the Shenzhen situation, but it's sure that there's often from those local policymakers much more zeal or much more incentive for them to enter into cooperations with ICSOs than there might be at the central policy level in Beijing. Yes, exactly, thanks for advancing. So finally, one overarching recommendation is to really be patient in terms of building relationships and networks. This is also clearly one reason why organizations that have played a role in China for now 20, 30, 40 years already have found it much easier to adapt to recent changes and recent restraints, and also motivation for them to stay even if work in China has become more difficult. While this is generally true that network and relationship building is extremely important and needs time, we assembled from those discussions in Hong Kong and from the interviews, we assembled a couple of additional ideas that could be implemented. First of all, when looking for contact on the ground in countries like Myanmar or Ethiopia, where there's a strong Chinese presence, usually Western donor meetings tend to be Western. This is what's being reported by many ICSOs. They're Western diplomats and civil society, potentially business actors that are regularly meeting in country. And it's difficult to engage here with East Asian actors overall, specifically with Chinese ones. So ICSOs could play a role in trying to make those donor meetings more inclusive and routinely include Chinese actors here to also at the same time improve their own contacts and their own working relationships. Then recruiting Chinese staff not only for in-China activities, which is of course doesn't need to be emphasized, but for global engagement activities, for the global China team, but also for activities in other countries, is both a necessity and also a growing opportunity, because there's a rapid professionalization process going on in the Chinese nonprofit sector due to those new university training programs on volunteering and nonprofit work. There are more and more young, professional, capable Chinese staff available to ICSOs who shouldn't be in this like paternalistic manner only be recruited for working in their own countries, but recruited for their actual capacity and also for their capacity to build better contacts with Chinese actors in other countries. The third approach is to go through UN agencies, which are overall, especially if we talk about UNDP, much better connected or have much easier access to Chinese governmental Chinese government or to the Chinese bureaucracy on development issues. In how far formal cooperations can be envisaged, some kind of trilateral cooperations is still an open question, but they do play a potential role as a link. And another issue of trilateral cooperation, this has been successfully done by official development agencies like the British DFID, having trilateral cooperation in country between a Western or European donor, a Chinese donor, and co-funding a project to the benefit of local populations. And how far this can be replicated for civil society actors is another thing we need to explore in the coming years.
Thank you. Bertram, we've got a couple of comments, I think, strongly reiterating the point that around ethical tech application, it's really about all global tech actors and not singling out specific countries, and also involving everyone constructively in formulating the debate. But there's also a really strong role for international CSOs in doing that. One of the things that we kind of saw in Hong Kong was ICSOs not necessarily linking up their China teams internally with those wider ethical tech conversations. So I think there's definitely, we identified room for strengthening there. But is there any other wider reflections that you have around the role of the ICSOs within this wider conversation?
So looking at the comments, I fully agree. I think this is also what I tried to say before on developmental actors, that looking for cross-sectoral approaches rather than singling out Chinese actors is generally preferable. Now, on the one hand, I do think even at the company level, it does make a huge difference whether a globally influential tech company is from a democratic country and accountable to a clear rule of law system, or whether, as in the case of Alibaba and Tencent, there are manifold informal connections with the Chinese party state, which we cannot even know about. So there is a qualitative distinction. However, in how far we need to single that out when we advocate, this is a very good question, and probably we shouldn't overplay this point. The point I wanted to make is that regardless of how you then design your public campaigns in terms of reflection, there needs to be much stronger attention to the role of Chinese companies, because we're mostly or almost exclusively here talking about Facebook, Google, Amazon, and the like. And both the similarities and the differences with those Chinese tech giants need to be much more closely watched, and there needs to be expertise or a combination of expertise on specific tech ethics issues and China issues routinely included, that's my point, into those international or Western-focused international formats.
And there was another point, you'll have to expand on this, but around how we can broaden the scope of the partners that we work with in terms of Chinese CSOs that are perhaps outside of some of the formal frameworks.
Yes, this is a very good question. So we're talking about like the type of organizations which are still registered as non-profit companies, right? Difficult in for activities within China, because here, but anyway, I mean, this is not the focus of this report, right? When we're talking about activities in mainland China, of course, it's difficult because of the severe restrictions imposed by the overseas NGO law. In terms of international cooperation, I think those formal aspects do not really play a constricting role. But I'm sorry, I do not have any specific good examples of how this worked in mind right now. So I would rather take this as a follow-up question to be further explored. I'm sorry, I cannot. This specific point didn't actually come up during the discussions also in Hong Kong, but it's a very interesting one to further explore.
Great. So now we'll move on to the final subtrend, which is the influence on the multilateral governance system.
Yes. So again, there's a more general trend at the UN level and in the UN ECOSOC committee, in particular, the UN NGO committee, which is accrediting organizations for ECOSOC in general, that more and more authoritarian governments are stepping up there or increasing their influence there, and are making it increasingly difficult also by mutually assisting each other for NGOs that are critical of those governments to be recognized and play an official role in the UN system. China is particularly successful. It's not particularly brazen or anything, but particularly successful in putting people on those UN bodies themselves. And this is something that's also being acknowledged by European diplomats as something that has been completely overlooked in the past decade in terms of the longer term implications. So when Western diplomats do not have this or do not pay sufficient attention here, there is a clear role for civil society monitoring of those kind of informal influences to make it more difficult for example, NGOs that are defending minority rights, human rights in general, to be accredited and to work within the UN system. More broadly, I think this is an obvious point, but which needs to be restated, that there needs to be more sector-wide solidarity with civil society organizations worldwide, not only but including against Chinese pressure to silence criticism of the government activities. On the other hand, we've had a couple of examples where ICSOs have been cooperating with Chinese Gongos and NGOs at the UN level, for example, hosting side events at UN conferences, which may be perfectly fine and useful when we talk about, for example, climate change or environmental issues, but shouldn't be done just for the sake of doing it, because there's also obvious risks associated, especially several Gongos, especially at the UN level, much more so than in actual development work. A lot of those organizations are really only there to, as the official slogan goes, to tell China's story and present China's good voice at the international level. So essentially replicating Chinese Communist Party discourse, and whether this is something that ICSOs want to amplify implicitly is an important question to be asked. On the other hand, we've had very interesting examples also by ICSOs helping smaller Chinese NGOs to come to those international platforms, again, in the environmental field where this is more feasible, and to both gain international experiences, but also share genuine local level Chinese experiences. So this is definitely a very important endeavor wherever this is possible. Okay, so on the other hand, I said this before with regards to tech, focusing on those issues where you have both a realistic chance of impact and also the unquestionable legitimacy to public advocacy and to uphold human rights standards. So the issue of interference in China's internal affairs is a controversial one, and you can ask in how far ICSOs can be rightly criticized for criticizing or for attacking Chinese actors. But when it comes to multinational corporations that are based in Europe or the US, and which are complicit in both censorship by agreeing to censorship guidelines, or in actual rights violations, as currently most notoriously in Xinjiang, where many Western companies and big multinational corporations are not only still present, but even expanding their investments there. So Volkswagen being one of the most prominent examples. Here it's really for civil society to ask critical questions and to hold those corporations accountable, because if civil society organizations don't do it and don't raise the public pressure, there's no incentive whatsoever for those companies to stand up or defend their principles against the requirements and the restrictions imposed by the Chinese government. So therefore, this is really an important focus for advocacy-oriented organizations. Obviously not easy to do for those that at the same time want to engage with Chinese actors because of the sensitivity. But here again, I think there's different roles for different types of civil society organizations, which is perfectly fine. And then finally, one issue that was actually, I think, underestimated also in our initial setup of the conference is the enormous global developmental, but also climate change impact of the Chinese consumer market and the steering capacity the Chinese government has over this market. So when we talk about issues like palm oil, soy production, etc., Chinese import policies here do play a tremendous role in many countries where tropical forests are being destroyed, etc. And so there's, on the other hand, while this negative impact is currently tremendous, there's also enormous potential that even slight policy adjustments by the Chinese government may massively or have massive potential benefits. So again, here in terms of like climate crisis mitigation, where the Chinese government does want to play a global leading role and does have this this reputational incentive, there is leeway to do so, both by ICSOs and together with Chinese actors. Also in terms of raising consumer awareness. So this may still be very difficult in the Chinese market, but it's something that civil society needs to look into in similar manners as in Europe, for example, that raising awareness to the environmental, social, etc. implications of certain products and production means need to be envisaged. And here again, I think the positive side is that as long as it's targeting mostly private sector companies, there's much more leeway to do so in the future than indirectly attacking governmental policies or governmental actors. Okay, I think
Thanks,
that's
Bertram.
it. Yeah.
That is, we have one comment back from an ICSO that has been engaging via the UN and academia in recruiting Chinese employees, but this approach is still not fully developed, and they've actually not really analysed how effective it's been.
I'm just reading the comment, sorry. So as far as I see the comment, I could only agree. Is there a question related to this, or? So
I mean, I interpret that as a.
So the point is that you make a difference between different sectors, and those where Chinese actors and also including gongos and NGOs can play a positive role, as in renewable energies, climate change, etc. There's potential for cooperation, while on other issues you need to lobby or do critical advocacy. If I understand that correctly, I can only fully agree with that.
I also think it's a comment that reflects the amount of time it takes and the different engagement approaches, and that a lot of those are still in their very early stages of working out how to strengthen it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, the comment before. I'm sorry. Yes.
So we probably have time for one or two more comments if there's anything in the chat. Okay, there doesn't seem to be anything. So just to wrap up, thank you very much for joining us today. You can this version of the webinar will be up on our YouTube channel shortly, as is the first webinar on organisational recommendations and recommendations for sector collaboration. So please go and catch that there if you haven't already seen it. We have an email group from the sector, which we formed after our Hong Kong meeting, which shares resources on and articles and opportunities around scanning China. So please get in touch with me if you'd like to be added to that list. My email is vtung@icscentre.org. In 2020, our deep dive will be looking at the interconnectedness of global trends and how to integrate this into organisational strategic planning. So again, if you're interested in that or the wider Scanning the Horizon community, please contact me or visit our website, and the address is there. But for now, I'd really like to thank you, Bertram, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Many thanks for your attention.